She stood beneath a chandelier worth more than most people's homes, wearing a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric remnants and silence. The invitation had not been extended to her, not by her husband, not by anyone. But Eleanor Ashford had learned something dangerous in 10 years of marriage to one of the wealthiest men in Manhattan. That the quiet ones are always underestimated. Tonight, at the Kensington Foundation Gala, Richard Ashford would announce his new partnership and his new woman in front of 600 guests. He didn't know his wife was already in the building. He didn't know what she carried in her pearl-clasped clutch. And he certainly didn't know that by midnight, every empire he'd built on her silence would come undone. The pearls had been her mother's. Eleanor turned them over in her palm as the town car crawled through midtown traffic, each bead cool and luminous against skin that hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. They were not expensive, not by the standards of the world she'd married into, but they were real, freshwater pearls harvested off the coast of Kyushu, strung on silk thread by a woman who believed that beauty was not something you purchased, but something you earned through patience. Her mother, Catherine Whitfield, had worn them on the day she married Eleanor's father in a small ceremony at St. Luke's in the village, back when Greenwich Village still smelled of espresso and turpentine rather than venture capital. Catherine had been a painter, not a famous one, not the kind whose name appeared at Christie's, but a woman who understood colour the way some people understand mathematics, intuitively, completely, in the marrow of her bones. Eleanor pressed the pearls against her sternum and breathed. Outside, the city blurred past in streaks of yellow and neon. Somewhere ahead, rising above the Park Avenue skyline like a glass monument to ambition, the Kensington Foundation's annual gala was already underway in the penthouse ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. 600 guests, 14 courses, a live orchestra flown in from Vienna, and at the center of it all, Richard Ashford, her husband of 10 years, father of her daughter, and the man who, 3 months ago, had looked her dead in the eye across the breakfast table and told her she was no longer relevant. Relevant. That was the word he'd used. Not unloved, not unwanted, relevant, as though she were a quarterly report that had failed to justify its own existence. She had not cried. That was the part that surprised even her. She'd simply set down her coffee cup, the blue ceramic one she'd bought at a street market in Lisbon on their honeymoon, and asked him what he meant. What he meant, it turned out, was everything. He meant that the board of Ashford Capital was uncomfortable with her public profile, too quiet, too bookish, too unpolished for the wife of a man worth $11 billion. He meant that his communications director, a razor-jawed woman named Patricia Clement, had drafted a transition strategy that would see Eleanor quietly relocated to the Connecticut estate, while Richard refreshed his personal brand. He meant that someone else, someone younger, shinier, someone whose Instagram following could be leveraged as a marketing asset, was already waiting in the wings. Her name was Vanessa Liu, and she was 26 years old. Eleanor had learned about Vanessa not from Richard, never from Richard, who parceled out truth the way misers parceled out coins, but from a manila envelope slipped under the door of her study by someone she still hadn't identified. Inside, photographs, time-stamped receipts from the Mandarin Oriental, a forwarded email chain between Richard and his attorney discussing prenuptial enforcement scenarios. The photographs were clinical in their intimacy. Vanessa in a silk robe on a balcony Eleanor recognized. It was the terrace of their penthouse in Monaco, the one Richard had told her was being renovated. Vanessa curled against Richard's shoulder at a corner table at Per Se, laughing at something he'd said with her head thrown back in a gesture so practiced it looked choreographed. Eleanor studied each image with the detachment of a surgeon examining X-rays. She noted the way Richard's hand rested on Vanessa's lower back, proprietary, performative. She noted the Cartier bracelet on Vanessa's wrist, the same Panthère de Cartier that had disappeared from Eleanor's jewelry case 6 weeks prior. She noted the date stamps and cross-referenced them against Richard's calendar, the one his assistant Margaret dutifully shared with her each Monday morning. Every supposed board meeting, every fabricated charity dinner, every lie catalogued and time-stamped. She did not confront him. She did not call a lawyer. Instead, Eleanor did something far more dangerous. She began to plan. The pearls were part of it, not as jewelry, as armor, a reminder of who she had been before Richard, before the penthouse and the private jets and the suffocating golden silence of being Mrs. Ashford. She had been Eleanor Whitfield, summa cum laude from Columbia, a woman who could read a balance sheet the way her mother read light, who had turned down a position at Goldman Sachs to build a non-profit literacy program in the South Bronx that still operated 15 years later. Richard had admired that once, at the beginning, before ambition curdled into control and admiration became something closer to surveillance. The car pulled to a stop. The driver, a discreet man named Samuel, who had worked for the family for 7 years and whose loyalty, Eleanor had quietly confirmed, was to her, turned and caught her eye in the mirror. "We're here, Mrs. Ashford." She looked up at the blazing entrance of the Waldorf. Flashbulbs popped. Town cars disgorged women in couture and men in bespoke tuxedos. She could hear the muffled thump of bass from the ballroom above, feel the electricity of 600 egos converging in a single room. Her dress was emerald green, not designer, not couture, but crafted with more intention than anything money could buy. She had sewn it herself over the course of 3 weeks, working late at night after their daughter Lily had gone to sleep. The fabric was a Duchess satin she'd found at Mood Fabrics on West 37th Street, the same shop where design students and dreamers had been sourcing material for decades. She'd cut the pattern from memory, based on a dress her mother had once sketched but never made, a clean A-line with a portrait neckline that framed the collarbones like a whispered declaration. She fastened the pearls around her neck. They settled into the hollow of her throat as though they'd been waiting. "Thank you, Samuel," she said. "I won't be long." She stepped out of the car and into the light, and the city held its breath. The ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings like frozen waterfalls, refracting light into 1,000 prismatic shards that scattered across marble floors and champagne flutes and the lacquered surfaces of women's lips. The orchestra, strings mostly, with a single harp positioned near the windows, played something by Debussy, the notes floating upward into a space designed to make human beings feel both magnificent and small. Richard Ashford stood at the center of it all, and he was radiant. That was the thing about Richard that people who'd never met him failed to understand. He was not merely wealthy, he was magnetic, 6'2", silver-templed at 44, with a jaw that belonged on a Roman coin and eyes the color of old whiskey. He moved through rooms the way weather systems move through landscapes, altering the atmosphere simply by existing. When he spoke, people leaned in. When he laughed, they felt chosen. Eleanor had once loved that about him. She had loved the way he could make a room of strangers feel like a room of friends, the way he quoted Neruda during dessert courses and remembered the names of every maitre d' between here and Monaco. She had loved the architecture of his ambition, the way he'd built Ashford Capital from a single office in Tribeca into a private equity empire that managed assets worth more than the GDP of several small nations. She had loved him the way you love a building you've helped construct, with pride and exhaustion and a dawning awareness that the foundation might not be as sound as you once believed. Now, standing unannounced in the mezzanine gallery above the ballroom, Eleanor watched her husband through the ornamental balustrade and felt nothing but the cool weight of pearls against her skin. Below, the gala was reaching its crescendo. The Kensington Foundation, Richard's most visible philanthropic venture, the one that generated the most favorable press coverage and the most lucrative tax deductions, was announcing its new 5-year strategic partnership with a biotech consortium. Richard would deliver the keynote. Cameras would flash. Donations would be pledged. And somewhere between the risotto course and the chocolate soufflé, he would introduce Vanessa Liu to the assembled guests. Not as his mistress, of course, but as the Foundation's newly appointed Director of Global Partnerships. Eleanor had obtained a copy of the evening's program from a sympathetic assistant at the Foundation's office. She'd read it twice. The title was absurd. Vanessa had no background in global partnerships or anything resembling non-profit work. Her LinkedIn profile, which Eleanor had studied with forensic attention, listed a degree in communications from a mid-tier university and a string of vaguely defined consulting roles that seemed to consist primarily of being photographed at events, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the optics. Richard was installing his mistress in a position of public legitimacy, laundering the affair through the machinery of philanthropy, and he was doing it tonight, in a room full of journalists and socialites and power brokers who would see exactly what he wanted them to see. A dynamic young woman being elevated by a visionary man. The audience would applaud. The photographers would capture it. And by tomorrow morning the narrative would be set. Vanessa Liu, protégé and partner. Not the other word, never the other word. Eleanor gripped the balustrade. Her knuckles whitened against the cold iron. She could see Vanessa now, on the far side of the ballroom, moving through the crowd like a blade through silk. She was striking. Eleanor would not deny that. Tall, slender, with hair like black lacquer and a dress that appeared to be held together by architectural engineering and sheer audacity. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned whether she belonged, which was a kind of power Eleanor recognized even as she resented it. But it was the bracelet that stopped her breathing. There it was, catching the chandelier light on Vanessa's left wrist, the Panthère de Cartier, white gold with emerald eyes and onyx spots. The bracelet Richard had given Eleanor on their 5th anniversary. He'd presented it at dinner in Paris, at a corner table at Le Cinq, with Lily sleeping in the hotel room upstairs and the Seine glittering beyond the windows. "For the woman who makes everything possible," he'd said. And Eleanor had believed him because believing him was the only architecture that held her life together. Now it circled another woman's wrist like a trophy. Something shifted inside Eleanor, not rage exactly, but something older and more structural. A load-bearing wall giving way, a foundation finally acknowledging the crack that had been spreading for years. She turned from the balustrade and descended the service staircase to the kitchen level where she'd arranged, through Samuel, to meet the one person in this building who owed Richard Ashford nothing. His name was James Whittaker, and he was the managing editor of the Manhattan Chronicle, a publication that had been trying to get inside Ashford Capital's books for 3 years. Eleanor had contacted him 2 weeks ago through an encrypted email, a skill she'd learned from a cybersecurity course she'd taken online. One of dozens of quiet competencies she'd accumulated during the long, invisible hours of being a billionaire's wife. James was waiting in the staff corridor near the loading dock, looking uncomfortable in a borrowed catering uniform. He was a compact man in his 50s with reading glasses perpetually sliding down his nose and an expression that suggested he'd seen enough of the world's machinery to know where the gears were rusted. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. "Eleanor," she corrected. "We're past formalities." She reached into her pearl-clasped clutch and withdrew a flash drive, small, silver, unremarkable. It contained copies of every document she'd assembled over the past 3 months, internal emails showing that the Kensington Foundation had been used to funnel money to shell companies controlled by Richard's associates, financial records demonstrating that donations intended for clean water initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa had been redirected to purchase real estate in Dubai, board minutes that had been falsified, tax filings that didn't match the Foundation's actual expenditures. Eleanor had found all of it, not through espionage or hacking, but through the simple, devastating act of paying attention, of reading the documents Richard left on his desk, of listening to the phone calls he took in the next room, of cross-referencing the numbers that didn't add up with the public filings that were supposed to make them disappear. She placed the flash drive in James Whittaker's palm. "Everything you need is on there," she said. "Financial records, correspondence, shell company registrations. I've included a timeline and index." James stared at the drive, then at her. "This could bring down more than your husband." "I know. The Foundation, the board members, the politicians they've donated to. This is a reckoning," Eleanor said quietly. "Publish it when you're ready. Not tonight. Give me until the weekend." James slipped the drive into his pocket. "Why the weekend?" Eleanor looked toward the distant sound of the orchestra. "Because tonight I have something else to do first." Richard Ashford had always believed that power was a form of storytelling. You didn't simply accumulate wealth. You narrated it. You shaped the way people perceived your rise, your decisions, your appetites. You hired communications directors and brand strategists and image consultants who understood that in the modern world, reality was less important than the story told about reality. And if you were very good, if you were Richard Ashford good, you could make people believe that the story and the truth were the same thing. Tonight's story was carefully constructed. He stood backstage in the Waldorf's green room, adjusting his cufflinks. Platinum, engraved with the Ashford Capital logo, a gift from the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund after a particularly lucrative deal, and reviewed his keynote one final time. The speech was clean, inspirational. 14 minutes of carefully calibrated rhetoric about global impact and transformative partnerships that would culminate in the introduction of Vanessa Liu as the foundation's newest senior leader. Patricia Clement, his communications director, had coached him on the optics. "You introduce her as a colleague, not a conquest," Patricia had said during their prep session that morning, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who managed reputations the way surgeons managed incisions. "Keep it professional. Touch her shoulder once. Not the waist, the shoulder. Let the cameras do the rest." Richard understood. He always understood. That was his gift. The ability to read a room, to calibrate his performance to the precise frequency that would produce the desired result. He had built an $11 billion empire on that gift. He had married Eleanor on that gift, choosing her not for passion but for narrative utility. A Columbia-educated humanitarian who provided the moral architecture his public image required. The mistake, though he did not recognize it as such because the architecture of his ego did not permit such recognition, was that he had begun to believe his own story. He believed that Eleanor was what he had decided she was, a decorative appendage, an agreeable silence, a woman so thoroughly domesticated by wealth and comfort that she had lost the capacity for independent thought. He believed this because it was convenient and because Eleanor had spent 10 years letting him believe it, performing the role of the quiet wife with such discipline that the performance had become, to Richard, indistinguishable from reality. He did not know about the flash drive. He did not know about James Whittaker. He did not know that the woman he had dismissed as irrelevant had spent 3 months constructing the instrument of his undoing with the same methodical patience her mother had used to mix pigments, and he certainly did not know that she was in the building. "5 minutes, Mr. Ashford," Margaret said, appearing at the green room door with her tablet pressed to her chest. Margaret Schultz, his executive assistant for 9 years, was the kind of woman who anticipated needs before they existed, a quality Richard relied on and did not appreciate. She was also, though Richard would never have guessed it, deeply fond of Eleanor and quietly appalled by what she had witnessed over the past year. "Where's Vanessa?" Richard asked. "In the ballroom, table 1. "Good. And Eleanor?" Margaret hesitated, a fraction of a second, barely perceptible. But Richard caught it because Richard caught everything except the things that mattered. "In Connecticut, as far as I know," Margaret said carefully. "She hasn't responded to messages today." Richard nodded, already moving on. "Fine, let's go." He strode through the service corridor toward the ballroom entrance, and the mistake widened beneath him like a crack in lake ice. Silent, structural, and irreversible. The keynote went exactly as planned. Richard took the stage to a standing ovation, not because the audience was genuinely moved, but because the audience understood that this was a room where standing ovations were the currency of access. The mayor was present. 2 sitting senators. The CEO of Goldman Sachs sat 3 tables from the stage, next to the editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair, and the widow of a pharmaceutical magnate whose family foundation had donated $14 million to the Kensington Foundation over the past decade. Richard spoke about vision, about responsibility, about the obligation of wealth to serve the common good. His voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who had rehearsed sincerity until it sounded organic, and the audience responded accordingly, nodding, smiling, lifting their champagne flutes in quiet salute. Then came the introduction. "And now," Richard said, his voice dropping to the intimate register he reserved for what Patricia called the reveal moments, I want to introduce someone extraordinary, a woman whose vision and energy represent the future of this foundation's global mission. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kensington Foundation's new Director of Global Partnerships, Vanessa Liu. Vanessa rose from table one with the fluid grace of a woman who had been rising from tables her entire life. The spotlight found her instantly, as though even the lighting technicians understood their role in the narrative, and she crossed to the stage in 4 strides, her heels clicking against the marble like a metronome counting down to something the audience couldn't yet hear. Richard kissed her cheek, not her lips. Patricia had been very clear about that, but the cheek, lingering just long enough to suggest what the cameras would later confirm, that this was not merely a professional introduction. The audience applauded. Vanessa smiled. Richard placed his hand on her shoulder, the shoulder as instructed, and the photographers erupted in a storm of flash and shutter. It was perfect. It was the worst mistake of his life, because at that precise moment, with 600 guests applauding, with cameras capturing the image that would dominate tomorrow's society pages, with Vanessa's bracelet-adorned wrist catching the light like a stolen constellation, the doors at the rear of the ballroom opened, and Eleanor Ashford walked in. She did not storm. She did not shout. She simply appeared, emerald dress, mother's pearls, a clutch purse held loosely in her left hand, and began walking toward the stage with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had already decided how this evening would end. The crowd didn't notice immediately. A few heads turned. A murmur rippled through the tables nearest the entrance. But Richard, still basking in the stage lights, didn't see her until she was 30 feet away, walking down the center aisle between tables 4 and 5, and by then it was too late to control the story. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, a flash of something that might have been fear, before settling into the smooth mask he wore when markets crashed and cameras appeared. "Eleanor," he said, and his microphone caught it. The name traveled through the speakers and across the ballroom, and 600 people turned to look at the woman in the emerald dress who was not supposed to be here. She stopped 10 feet from the stage. The orchestra had gone silent. The clink of crystal and silverware ceased. Even the waitstaff paused, trays balanced on upturned palms, as the room collectively understood that something unscripted was about to happen in a world where everything was scripted. Eleanor looked at Richard, then at Vanessa, then at the bracelet on Vanessa's wrist, and she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a cruel smile. It was the smile of the woman who had finally decided to stop performing, and it was more terrifying than any scream. The silence lasted 7 seconds. Eleanor counted them the way her mother had once counted heartbeats before applying the first stroke of paint to a blank canvas, not in anxiety but in reverence for the moment before everything changed. 7 seconds during which Richard's face flickered through its repertoire of masks. 7 seconds during which Vanessa Liu's practiced composure cracked just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it. 7 seconds during which 600 of the most powerful people in New York held their breath and waited for the story to reveal itself. Eleanor reached the foot of the stage. She did not climb the steps. She didn't need to. The microphone in Richard's hand was still live, and the acoustics of the ballroom were designed to carry voices the way cathedrals carry prayers. "Good evening," she said, and her voice was steady. Not loud, she had never been loud, but clear in the way that truth is clear when it enters a room that has been furnished with lies. "Eleanor." Richard recovered quickly. He always recovered quickly. It was his most dangerous talent. He spread his hands in a gesture of welcome that was also, Eleanor noted, a gesture of containment. "What a wonderful surprise. Ladies and gentlemen, my wife, Eleanor Ashford." Polite applause, confused glances. The mayor leaned toward an aide and whispered something. "I apologize for the interruption," Eleanor said, addressing the room rather than her husband. "I know this evening has been carefully planned and I don't intend to take much of your time, but I believe the guests of the Kensington Foundation deserve to hear something that wasn't included in tonight's program." Richard's smile tightened. "Eleanor, this isn't the—" The Kensington Foundation, Eleanor continued, has received over $200 million in donations over the past 5 years. Donations from people in this room. Donations given in good faith with the belief that they would fund clean water initiatives, educational programs, and medical infrastructure in developing communities. She paused. Let the words settle. I have spent the past 3 months reviewing the Foundation's internal financial records, not the public filings, the actual records, the ones that show where the money went. A murmur moved through the room like wind through wheat. Richard's hand dropped to his side. The microphone, still in his grip, transmitted the faint sound of his breathing. Quick, controlled, the breathing of a man calculating options. "Eleanor, you're clearly not well," he said, and his voice carried the particular tenderness reserved for dismissing women in public. Gentle, pitying, devastating. "Let's step outside and—" $47 million, Eleanor said, and the number landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. That's the amount that was diverted from the Foundation's clean water program to a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Companies controlled by members of this Foundation's board. Companies that purchased luxury real estate in Dubai, Monaco, and the British Virgin Islands. The murmur became a roar. Eleanor reached into her clutch and withdrew not the flash drive, that was already with James Whittaker, but a single sheet of paper, folded twice. She held it up so the room could see it, though no one could read it from that distance. The gesture was theatrical, and she knew it. She had learned something from Richard after all. That in a room full of powerful people, the story mattered as much as the substance. "This is a summary of the financial discrepancies I've documented," she said. "Copies have already been provided to a major news publication, along with supporting evidence. I'm sharing this tonight not for revenge, although I understand if it appears that way, but because the people in this room who donated to this foundation deserve the truth." She looked at Richard. He was pale now, the silver at his temples suddenly looking less distinguished and more like the first visible symptom of decay. Vanessa had taken a step back, her hand, the one wearing Eleanor's bracelet, pressed against her sternum as though trying to hold something in. "I also want to be transparent about something personal," Eleanor said, and her voice softened. "My husband and I are separating. That is a private matter, and I won't discuss the details here. But I believe that when someone uses the machinery of philanthropy to conceal both financial fraud and personal betrayal, the private becomes public." She folded the paper and returned it to her clutch. The pearls caught the light as she moved, sending small, luminous signals across the silent ballroom. "I'm sorry to have disrupted your evening," she said. "Please enjoy the rest of the gala." She turned and walked back up the center aisle. The silence held until she reached the doors. Then the room erupted. It was not a single sound, but a symphony of reactions. Gasps, whispers, the scrape of chairs as people reached for their phones. The mayor stood up. The Goldman Sachs CEO was already in conversation with his general counsel. 3 photographers broke from the press line and pursued Eleanor into the corridor, their cameras firing like automatic weapons. Backstage, Patricia Clement was making calls with the controlled fury of someone watching a building she'd constructed be demolished in real time. "Get legal on the phone, get the PR team, get everyone." On stage, Richard stood alone. Vanessa had disappeared, slipped away through a side door with the survival instinct of someone who had always understood that proximity to power was not the same as possessing it. The bracelet was still on her wrist. She would remove it in the cab home and drop it into a drawer she would never open again. Richard's hand was still wrapped around the microphone, and for the first time in his adult life, he had nothing to say. The silence coming from the speakers was the loudest sound in the room, the sound of a narrative collapsing, of a story that had sustained an empire revealing itself to be, at its core, a lie. He set the microphone down with a small, precise click. And in the corridor outside the ballroom, Eleanor Ashford, née Whitfield, daughter of a painter, mother of Lily, wearer of freshwater pearls, walked towards the elevator with her head up and her hands steady, carrying nothing but a clutch purse and the unshakable knowledge that she had finally, after 10 years, told the truth. She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped inside. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirrored interior. Emerald dress, pearls, the faint ghost of a woman she used to be flickering beneath the surface of the woman she had become. She looked, she thought, like someone her mother would have wanted to paint. The elevator descended. The city waited, and somewhere above her, in a ballroom that smelled of champagne and ruin, the story Richard Ashford had spent his life constructing was already beginning to come apart. The fallout was architectural. Not the sudden cinematic kind, no single explosion, no dramatic collapse visible from a distance. It was structural, incremental. The way a building fails when its foundation has been compromised. First, the hairline cracks in the plaster, then the doors that won't close properly, then the groan of load-bearing walls adjusting to a truth they can no longer support. By Saturday morning, 48 hours after the gala, James Whittaker's exposé ran on the front page of the Manhattan Chronicle under a headline that would become, in the weeks that followed, a kind of shorthand for a very specific type of American corruption. Ashford Foundation diverted $47 million in charitable funds to shell companies. The article was meticulous. Whittaker had taken Eleanor's documents and spent the intervening days verifying every claim, cross-referencing her financial records with public filings, corporate registrations in the Caymans and BVI, and property records in Dubai. He'd reached out to the Foundation's auditing firm, which declined to comment. He'd contacted 3 of the board members named in the documents, 2 hung up, and 1, a retired hedge fund manager named Gerald Fontaine, threatened legal action before the call was 30 seconds old. But the numbers were clean. Eleanor had been thorough, not just accurate but anticipatory, organizing the evidence in a way that answered the questions a journalist would ask before he asked them. Whittaker told his deputy editor, over coffee at 3 in the morning while they finalized the layout, that he'd never received a source package so complete. "She's not a whistleblower," he said. "She's a prosecutor who forgot to go to law school." The story detonated across the media landscape with the force of something that had been building pressure for years. By noon Saturday, every major outlet had picked it up. CNN ran a chyron that stayed on screen for 6 consecutive hours. The New York Times assigned a 4-person team to a follow-up investigation. Social media predictably transformed the story into 1,000 smaller stories. Memes, threads, opinion pieces, a trending hashtag that oscillated between outrage and admiration. And then there was the video. Someone in the ballroom, a junior staffer, it turned out, positioned near the sound booth, had recorded Eleanor's speech on their phone. The footage was shaky, poorly lit and devastating. 47 seconds of a woman in an emerald dress telling the truth to a room that had been built to resist it. It was uploaded to YouTube at 7:14 a.m. Saturday morning, and by Sunday evening it had been viewed 11 million times. Eleanor watched none of it. She was in the kitchen of a rented brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, a place she'd secured 3 weeks before the gala, paying 6 months' rent in advance from a personal account Richard didn't know about. The apartment was small by the standards of the life she was leaving. 2 bedrooms, a galley kitchen, a living room with bay windows that overlooked a garden where someone had planted wisteria that wouldn't bloom for another month. Lily sat at the kitchen table, drawing. She was 8 years old, serious-eyed and sharp in the way that children are when they've grown up around adults who use words as weapons. She drew with the concentrated attention of her grandmother. The same slight furrow between the brows, the same way of holding the pencil close to the tip for maximum control. "Mom," Lily said without looking up from her drawing, "is Dad in trouble?" Eleanor poured orange juice and considered the question with the same care she applied to everything involving her daughter. She had promised herself, on the night she first read the manila envelope's contents, that Lily would not become collateral. That whatever war she waged against Richard, it would not be fought on the terrain of their child's heart. "Dad made some mistakes with his work," Eleanor said. "Grown-up mistakes. People are asking him questions about it, and that's going to be confusing for a while." Lily absorbed this. She drew a circle, then another circle inside it, then colored the space between them purple. It looked, Eleanor thought, like a pearl. "Is that why we moved here?" Partly. I also wanted us to have our own place for a while, just you and me. Lily looked up. And the wisteria. Eleanor smiled. It was the first real smile she'd managed in days. And the wisteria. The phone rang. It had been ringing all morning. Reporters, Richard's lawyers, her own attorney, a formidable woman named Diana Reeves, whom Eleanor had retained 6 weeks before the gala with the same quiet precision she'd applied to everything else. Eleanor let most calls go to voicemail, but Diana's she answered. "Have you seen the Journal?" Diana asked without preamble. "No." "The Wall Street Journal is reporting that the SEC has opened a preliminary inquiry into the Kensington Foundation's finances. 2 board members have already resigned. Gerald Fontaine's attorney is apparently negotiating a cooperation agreement." Eleanor leaned against the kitchen counter. Through the window she could see the bare wisteria vines, their skeletal fingers reaching upward as though grasping for a season that hadn't arrived yet. What about Richard? His legal team filed for an emergency gag order this morning. Denied. The judge cited public interest. Diana paused. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something. Richard's attorneys contacted me an hour ago. They want to negotiate, not the divorce, the foundation matter. They're offering a significant settlement in exchange for your public silence." "How significant?" $200 million, plus the Connecticut estate, full custody of Lily, and a non-disclosure agreement that would cover everything. The foundation, the affair, all of it. $200 million. It was more money than Eleanor had ever conceptualized as a personal figure. It was enough to fund her literacy non-profit for a century. It was enough to ensure that Lily would never want for anything. It was also, Eleanor understood with perfect clarity, a bribe. "No," she said. "Eleanor, the evidence is already public, Diana. An NDA wouldn't put the genie back in the bottle. And even if it could, I didn't do this for money. I did it because people donated to a foundation that was supposed to help communities, and that money was stolen. Silence at this point would make me complicit." Diana was quiet for a moment. "You know he'll fight the divorce." "I know." "He'll try to take Lily." Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone. She looked at her daughter, still drawing at the kitchen table, still coloring the space between circles in deepening shades of purple. "He can try," Eleanor said. "But I have every email, every document, every timestamp, and I have the truth. That's enough." She hung up and sat down across from Lily. "What are you drawing?" Lily held up the paper. It was a woman standing in a garden surrounded by purple flowers. The woman wore a green dress and something small and round at her throat. "That's you," Lily said, "when the wisteria blooms." Eleanor reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "That's beautiful," she said, and meant it in every sense of the word. The courtroom was not what people expected. Divorce proceedings for billionaires were supposed to happen behind closed doors, in mahogany-paneled conference rooms with pitchers of ice water and attorneys who billed at $2,000 an hour. They were supposed to be quiet, surgical, sanitized. The dirty laundry was supposed to be negotiated into silence, the wreckage cleared before anyone with a camera could photograph it. Richard Ashford's attorneys had requested exactly that. A closed proceeding, sealed records, no media access. They cited the welfare of the minor child and the integrity of ongoing regulatory proceedings, and a dozen other legal euphemisms that translated in plain English to, "We don't want anyone to see this." Judge Patricia Harmon denied the motion. She was a compact woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair, pulled back in a bun so tight it looked structural. She'd served on the New York Supreme Court bench for 18 years and had a reputation for 2 things: an encyclopedic knowledge of matrimonial law and an allergy to performative nonsense. When Richard's lead attorney, a towering man named Thaddeus Burke, who was famous for representing disgraced executives, made his impassioned argument for privacy, Judge Harmon listened with the patience of someone watching a dog chase its own tail. "Mr. Burke," she said when he'd finished, "the respondent is the subject of an active SEC investigation. The foundation at the center of this proceeding is a matter of significant public interest. Your client's desire for privacy, while understandable, does not outweigh the public's right to observe these proceedings. Motion denied." The courtroom gallery was packed. Reporters filled every available seat. The sketch artists, two of them positioned at opposite ends of the gallery, worked with the focused intensity of people who understood that the images they produced would appear in every major publication by evening. Eleanor entered through a side door, dressed in navy blue, a deliberate choice Diana Reeves had suggested that communicated seriousness without severity. The pearls were around her neck. They had become, in the weeks since the gala, something of a symbol. A blogger had written a widely shared essay titled "The Pearl Necklace That Toppled a Billionaire," which Eleanor found both flattering and reductive. The pearls weren't a weapon, they were a talisman, a reminder of origin. Richard entered from the opposite side, flanked by Burke and two junior attorneys who carried matching leather briefcases. He looked diminished, not physically, not yet, but in some essential quality of presence. The magnetism that had powered his rise, that had filled ballrooms and boardrooms with its invisible force, had dimmed. He moved through the courtroom the way light moves through dirty glass, present but diffused, stripped of its capacity to dazzle. He did not look at Eleanor. She noticed this and understood its meaning. He was afraid. Not of her. Richard had never been afraid of anyone, but of what she represented. The uncontrolled variable, the story he couldn't narrate. The proceedings lasted 3 days. What emerged, piece by piece, was a portrait of a marriage that had been, from its inception, an act of strategic architecture. Richard's attorneys argued that Eleanor had been a willing participant in the lifestyle, that she had benefited from the wealth, enjoyed the privileges, accepted the trade-offs. They presented evidence of credit card statements, travel itineraries, the cost of maintaining the Connecticut estate. Diana Reeves dismantled each argument with surgical precision. She called Margaret Schultz to the stand. Margaret, who had served as Richard's executive assistant for 9 years, testified for 4 hours. She described the surveillance apparatus Richard had built around Eleanor, the monitoring of her phone, her email, her movements. She described the way Richard had gradually isolated Eleanor from friends and family, cancelling social engagements on her behalf, redirecting her mail, ensuring that the only information Eleanor received about the outside world was filtered through channels Richard controlled. He called it brand management. Margaret said, her voice steady but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He said Mrs. Ashford's public interactions needed to be curated. But what he meant was controlled. He wanted to know where she was, who she spoke to, and what she said at all times. The courtroom was silent. The sketch artists drew furiously. Diana then presented the financial evidence, not the foundation fraud, which was being handled by the SEC, but the personal finances. She demonstrated that Richard had systematically excluded Eleanor from meaningful financial decisions, despite the fact that she had been instrumental in the early growth of Ashford Capital. She produced emails from 2016 in which Eleanor had identified a critical flaw in a proposed acquisition, a flaw that would have cost the firm $300 million. And Richard had taken credit for the analysis in a board presentation the following week. She produced the prenuptial agreement, which Richard's attorneys had drafted and which Eleanor had signed at 24, 3 days before their wedding, without independent legal counsel. The agreement was, Diana argued, unconscionable, designed not to protect both parties, but to ensure that Eleanor would leave the marriage with almost nothing. "My client signed this document," Diana told the judge, "under conditions that any court would recognize as coercive. She was young, she was in love. She was told by her future husband that asking for changes would be a sign of distrust. She had no independent attorney review the document, and the agreement itself contains provisions that effectively punish her for the marriage ending, regardless of the cause." Judge Harmon studied the agreement. Her expression did not change, but something in the quality of her attention shifted, a focusing, a narrowing, the look of someone who had seen this particular pattern before and recognized it for what it was. Richard sat motionless throughout. His attorneys made objections, sustained some, overruled others, but the architecture of their defense was crumbling. Each piece of evidence Eleanor's team presented was a brick removed from the wall, and the structure Richard had built was revealing itself to be exactly what it had always been, a facade. On the third day, something unexpected happened. Vanessa Liu appeared. She was not called as a witness. She came voluntarily, arriving at the courthouse in a town car with tinted windows, wearing a black coat and an expression that Eleanor, watching from the plaintiff's table, could only describe as complicated. There was anger in it, certainly, but also something that looked improbably like resolve. Vanessa asked to testify. Burke objected vehemently. Judge Harmon overruled him. What Vanessa described under oath was a relationship she now understood to be a transaction. Richard had approached her at a fundraiser 18 months earlier, presented himself as separated from his wife, and offered her a role in his professional orbit that was, from the beginning, contingent on a personal one. He had given her gifts, the bracelet among them, that she later learned belonged to Eleanor. He had promised her a future that she now realized was a script designed to serve his needs and discard hers when they were no longer useful. "I'm not here to ask for sympathy," Vanessa said, and her voice carried the raw quality of someone speaking without rehearsal for the first time in a long while. "I made choices, but I made them based on lies. And I think Mrs. Ashford deserves to know that I understand, at least partly, what it feels like to be manipulated by someone who treats people as instruments." She turned and looked directly at Eleanor. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Two women who had been in different ways consumed by the same fire. Something passed between them that was not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps its precursor, recognition. Eleanor held Vanessa's gaze and gave the smallest of nods. Vanessa left the stand. She removed the Cartier bracelet from her wrist, there in the courtroom, in front of the cameras and the sketch artists and the judge, and placed it on the witness box. "This isn't mine," she said simply, and walked out. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, if you felt Eleanor's strength, her silence, and her refusal to break, then you understand something powerful about resilience. We don't always get justice handed to us. Sometimes we have to build it ourselves, one quiet decision at a time. Eleanor's story reminds us that our worth is never defined by those who underestimate us, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way into the light. If you connected with this story, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss another story. Drop a comment below. Tell us, what would you have done at that gala?